In this first video, I'd like to explain for teachers and parents who are using courses in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy or are considering doing so, how literature studies in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy differ from what's available elsewhere, what our goals are, and then into some practical details of how our literature courses actually work and what we seek to accomplish in them. So let's start out by just saying the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is different from other schools in that we teach and focus on the classical liberal arts. Other programs don't do that. Other programs may have a Latin class, they may have a Greek class, they may have what they call a logic class, but they don't teach the classical liberal arts from their sources across the whole curriculum. We do that because we are preparing our students, or at least making it possible for our students to gain the skills available to them through the mastery of the classical liberal arts. That's the goal of education. Not just classical education, that's the goal of education, period, is to give our children the arts that they need to move on and to do good things, which are gained through the classical liberal arts. Reading, writing, speaking, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, these are the foundational arts on which all other studies depend. And we seek to provide mastery of those arts to our students in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Now, when it comes to literature, the works that we read, almost all of them, were composed by men and women who themselves were educated in the classical liberal arts. Make a list of the authors. Make a list of the great books. What you'll see is that the authors were classically educated men and women. They studied classical grammar, classical reasoning, classical rhetoric, moral philosophy, Catholic theology, on and on. That's what makes most of the authors of history great. They were students and masters of the classical liberal arts, and they then produced works that became famous. Now, for our students who study the classical liberal arts, they have a unique relationship to the authors of all of these works. Many of them, they actually study the same textbooks as those authors studied when they were in school. And our students, by studying the classical liberal arts, are able to see things in these works that modern students simply don't understand. For example, you can read the works of Shakespeare, and Shakespeare was a man who studied grammar with Lilly's Latin Grammar. That's a book that we use in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy today. Our students experience and study the same lessons that Shakespeare did when he was learning grammar. And there are many places in Shakespeare's writings where you'll only understand things he's saying if you shared his education. It's sort of a secret knowledge among students who have that education. When we take a book like Homer's Odyssey, or Virgil's Aeneid, or Dante's Divine Comedy, we're studying a poem composed by a master of the classical liberal arts. And our classical liberal arts education gives us insights into those works that modern students and critics just don't have. Now, the reason why that's important is because we're not using literature to replace television. We're not looking to entertain ourselves with stories. We're not saying, hey, television is idle. You're just sitting around passively watching movies. Here, read this book. That's the same thing. Reading literature for the sake of self-entertainment, you might as well just watch television. It's the same thing. And that's not the purpose of literature studies. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, when we teach children literature, we focus on the right things when we study literature. First of all, we focus on the author, because these are works that are produced by men. Homer took blank sheets of paper and composed the Iliad and the Odyssey. Virgil started with blank sheets of paper and composed the Aeneid. Dante, blank paper turned into the Divine Comedy. These are human works, and what's valuable about them is that human beings making use of the liberal arts composed these works. Not just the liberal arts, but also of their philosophy and theology studies. These studies, which we're seeking to give our students, are the sources of these works. And what we want to focus on in our literature studies is the author and how he produced the work. What techniques he used, what learning he used, what strategies he used, what methods and figures he used to produce the work that was produced. Because these are not movies for us to just sit back and watch and get wrapped up in the story like children. These are works of human literature that often have a purpose, a historical context, a theological context, a philosophical context, and the authors used their skills to compose a work that hundreds or thousands of years later are still having an effect on people. And what our interest is in these works, primarily our interest is seeing the art of the author and how he composed and put together the work that he composed, because we're looking to learn from their example and take something away that we can use in our own art, in our own writing and speaking. We're seeking to look at these works through the eyes of the author, not as spectators idly watching a movie on a screen. So that's a major difference. We're not interested in the trivia, we're not interested in the names and places and things like that. We're interested in the real art of the composition, of the invention, the development of the ideas, the development of the characters, the themes, the actual composition techniques used by the author to put the work together and make everything credible and influential, persuasive. We're looking for the arts on display in these works of literature. We're not just reading books to entertain ourselves. That's idleness, and that's not a part of formal education. Now, the problem that I would propose with regard to great books programs is that if we look at these great books programs, we often find people who are trying to get into this literature without studying the classical liberal arts. And so great books studies really become leisure reading, and that's not the purpose of literature in a formal study program or in a school. Look, if you'd like to sit down on a Sunday afternoon and just flip through Dante's Divine Comedy as leisure reading, that's fine. But that has nothing to do with formal academic work in literature as a subject. Formal literature study is a study of examples that can be used by students to improve their own composition. It's not just collecting lists of stories that we can tell and share when we talk about what our favorite characters and events were. We need to study literature with a focus on the author and a focus on the arts that are at work in the composition of the works we study. That study can only be done by students who are learning those arts through studying the classical liberal arts. So the problem that I have with great books programs is that usually they are reading literature as idle children, reading stories, maybe discussing things in the reading, maybe discussing some events or ideas, things like that, but they're unable to look at those works critically from the perspective of the classical liberal arts, which are directly responsible for these works in history. Now, what we do in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy with our students as they work through different works of literature is we ask them to focus on a number of issues and to trace these issues through the works of literature, whatever they're reading. First of all, we ask them to consider these books as sources of information in a number of different subject areas. And so we provide a standard set of of reflection questions for the children to work on as they read any book. And we focus on religion, philosophy, rhetoric, and history. So for example, if we're reading the Odyssey, the kids, one of the questions that they'll have to answer for every assigned reading is they'll have to say, what can we learn about ancient religion from this present reading? And so we'll look at things that come up in the reading, like, oh, we were introduced to this priest, and we saw an example of a sacrifice that was made to the gods. We see that they believed that keeping vows and promises was a sacred obligation, and that there were divine punishments for those who broke vows and oaths that they had made. And we start to collect all these little bits and pieces of useful religious information from these ancient sources, from these literary sources. We collect religious ideas and principles from these works. We do the same thing for philosophy. I'll ask the kids to look, as we're reading the Divine Comedy, for example, what do we learn? Do we find anything in Dante's writing that reveals to us something about medieval natural philosophy? The way that they looked at the earth, the way that they looked at the heavens, the way they understood medicine or chemicals or food, anything like that, how the body worked, medicine, healthcare. Is there any philosophical information that we can draw as we read Dante's Divine Comedy? How about moral philosophy? Do we find any ethical teaching in Dante's Divine Comedy? What moral principles can we deduce from this reading, and so forth? We look for examples of philosophical information in these studies. Thirdly, we look for rhetorical examples. We look for good examples of rhetoric at work in these writings. I'll ask the kids to make a list of figures of speech that they encounter in the reading that the author uses to accomplish his goals in communicating in his work. We'll list figures of speech and things like that. And then lastly, historical information. What important historical information can we glean from this work of literature? Again, not necessarily looking at the story itself, which is fictional, but looking at the author in his context, and trying to glean some historical information from what the author is saying at a certain time in history in a certain historical context. We gather this kind of information from these works using literature as a primary source for historical and philosophical and religious studies, and for examples of the principles that we're learning as we study rhetoric in the classical liberal arts. That's the difference between studying literature within the context of classical liberal arts studies, as opposed to studying it in a modern school, even a modern, classical school that's not teaching the classical liberal arts and pretending that it's going to get into classical works of literature which are directed by those classical liberal arts. John Henry Newman, in his book On the Idea of a University, warned, and I quote this in a number of places in articles that I've written, he warns that in an age like this, and he wrote this a century ago, in an age like this where books abound, many mistake the love of reading for real learning. And so there's a difference between reading and real learning, as Newman would point out. What that difference is, he explains further in that passage. He explains that those who love reading are actually motivated not by any real study or interest in the real goals of study, but they're just interested in something new. It's always got to be something new. It's like kids flipping through television channels. It's like kids scrolling through TikTok videos or YouTube videos. It's just this constant, flood of new images and ideas and stories and events. It's just entertainment. It's just leisure and pleasure seeking. It's not study. And we have to distinguish between that kind of the love of reading, as Newman explains, and real learning. So by focusing on the classical liberal arts and by using literature as a means of helping us in our study of the classical liberal arts, in our study of theology, in our study of philosophy. We can make good, prudent use of world literature, but we can't allow it to degenerate into a lazy great books program with random class discussions about things that may appeal to a certain teacher or to certain students. There are objective, real arts at work in the works of literature, and we can only appreciate them if we study them in the context of the classical liberal arts. And that's something we focus on in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. So I think that's a good overview of how literature works in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, what we ask the kids to focus on, what kind of assignments we require the kids to complete as they do their studies, and so on. We always assume that our students are busy. Our students have so much work to do just with the classical liberal arts that to get into literature, there's really not a lot of time for it. And those studies have to be efficient and they have to be fruitful. We don't have time to sit around reading idle stories and books and writing book reports just to prove that we've, read certain stories or know certain characters or can, participate in some kind of literary trivia games. Our students don't have time to waste in reading random books or reading without any real clear objectives. And that's why literature in our program has a sort of a limited role with a very efficient purpose that we focus on in our literature studies. I just want to say one thing about sources of our reading. We tend to stick to English translations, at least for now, because this generation isn't ready to get into the works in the original languages. And what we're doing and will continue to do is select translations or editions that we recommend for the kids and making them available in CLA editions of those books. This is an example of the Divine Comedy by Dante. The reason why it's important for us to put our own copies of these books out for the kids is that, for one thing, since we control the printing and the publishing of these books, we can add notes and things like that are helpful for our students in the CLA. The other thing is that when we're using books published by other publishing companies, we can't control what goes in and out of print, how editions change and things like that. So by having our own copies that we publish ourselves, we can make sure that when we develop a course on a certain book, the translation will always be available, the exact edition of the book will always be available, and we can make these available for free to the kids in the form of a PDF file, or parents can choose to buy printed copies and have the kids work for them, in a copy they can hold in their hand. So we're not only working on developing these literature courses that serve the classical liberal arts, we're also working on developing our own copies of the books and editions that we recommend to the kids to study them with. So we hope that we can develop a rich, purposeful literature program that helps the kids not only satisfy modern school requirements, but also really serve true classical liberal arts education in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Now, I know there's tons that we could talk about, what books we study, all that. I'm happy to discuss those things, and we're going to continue as we walk through this literature course for teachers and parents. We're going to get into all these details, but if there's anything you'd like to ask me, anything you'd like to ask me to talk about in these videos or get into, please contact me by email or on the forums or in live chat, and I'll make sure that we get all those questions and issues answered and addressed as we go through this. What we're going to do is walk through these books together over the course of the year as we go through these lessons. And what I'm going to do is demonstrate for you how I would approach teaching the major works of world literature from the perspective of the classical liberal arts. So you'll see that, get a taste of it, and then be able to help your children succeed in it as you teach it, or as you lead your children through it at home or in a private school. So I hope that's helpful. I look forward to this study. Please communicate, ask any questions you have. I hope that's helpful for you. God bless.